how nutrition impacts neurodegenerative disease, how maybe neurodegenerative disease can be caused by nutritional deficiencies and things like that, or sort of the flip side of that, which is are there nutritional interventions that might slow down or reverse or help prevent things like Alzheimer's? And I think you've done some work there as well. Maybe you can tell us where a good place to start is.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of my favorite topics to discuss. I've been working on the nutritional aspects tied to neurodevelopmental and neurodegenerative diseases now for about 15 years. Started this work as a graduate student at Cornell University, and what we know about the role of diet in the prevention of disorders like Alzheimer's disease is that there's a lot of data showing that the MIND diet, right? So this is known as a Mediterranean DASH diet, which is very heavy on berries, poultry, fish, for example, that have a lot of nutrients that are critically important for our body, right? Antioxidants, for example. There's a lot of actual clinical trials and evidence showing that that is beneficial for an individual in terms of their brain health and deterring from disorders like Alzheimer's disease. So the Mediterranean DASH diet, also known as the MIND diet, has a lot of efficacy in that regard. Now, tied to the work that we do, we focused primarily on what's known as choline. So choline is a B-like vitamin nutrient that is critically important for a variety of body and brain related functions, right? You can produce choline endogenously through your liver. However, studies have shown that it's not enough for the roles that it plays in your body, right? And so
Mhm.
we can touch on what those specific roles are. So one, it plays a role in fat metabolism. If you don't eat sufficient choline per day, you tend to see that individuals develop fatty liver disease,
Hmm.
right? That's in fact why the Institute of Medicine in 1998 first made the recommendations for choline for men and women, adult men and women, which are currently for adult women, they're 425 milligrams per day, and for men, 550 milligrams per day. Now, there's also a recommendation for pregnant women because choline is critically important in building phospholipids, which is essentially what builds our cell membranes, right? That
Mhm.
protects things from going in and out of our cells. Women are required to consume 550 milligrams of choline per day, and not doing so has actually shown to potentially cause neurotube defects and neurodevelopmental delays and disorders as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
Okay.
So one of the main areas of choline's functional effects is fat metabolism, broadly speaking, all different aspects of what the body does with fats.
Yes, yes, it is. It allows for the processing of fats. It works closely with, once again, your liver. And it also intriguingly plays a role in regulation of insulin, right?
Hmm.
So, as we know, diabetes is a big problem in the United States and really the world. And what we're finding is that that fat that accumulates in your body because of lack of choline can actually contribute to insulin resistance, which is a feature of type 2 diabetes. Now, if you look at the cases of type 2 diabetes, those that have it, the percentage of individuals with that disorder that develop Alzheimer's disease is really high, close to
Mm.
80%, right? So it's all actually linked back
Yeah.
to metabolic function and fat metabolism, right? Having improper ability to reduce fatty liver disease can then trigger a cascade of events throughout your body that can then predispose the individual to actually develop disorders like Alzheimer's
Yeah.
disease.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm hearing more and more people talk about Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes. Maybe we'll loop back to that, but
Sure.
with choline, before diving into some of the details here, where do you normally find it? What foods are abundant in choline?
Yeah, very good question. So the one of the top one of the foods where you find choline in high concentration is going to be eggs, right?
Mm.
So eggs have a very, very high concentration of choline. If you eat three eggs, you're pretty much hitting the recommended amount that you need per day. It's found in poultry, it's found in fish. It is found in red meats, leafy greens, and grains. Now, as you recall, I talked about the MIND diet early on, right? Where I said the MIND diet, that requires poultry and fish, etc. All those components that make up the MIND diet are also very, very rich in choline, right?
Mhm.
So the idea is that that diet plays a very important role because it not only has other forms of omega-3s, for examples, and antioxidants, but it also is enriched by choline.
Yes, and an important thing to point people to here, if you can shed any light on this, please do. But as with pretty much any nutrient, there is usually there's a key difference between the nutrient content of a food, how much is inside of it, and the bioavailability of that nutrition. And I would imagine, without knowing the specifics myself about choline in particular, that the nutrient bioavailability is going to differ quite a bit between some of those different foods that you mentioned.
Yeah, they do differ. As I mentioned, in eggs, you typically have more choline that's going to be present. In terms of the poultry and the fish, you usually find high concentrations there as well. With some of the leafy greens, you do have it, but it's not available in really high concentrations. And there is then an issue that actually I wrote an editorial on that I think is really important to point out. What happens to, for example, plant-based eaters, right? So
Mm.
plant-based eaters don't have access to fish, poultry because they don't consume those products. Does that mean that they're more likely to be deficient in choline? And the answer to that is yes. But you still have the ability to buy over-the-counter supplements for choline, and they're pretty affordable. That allows you to reach the level of choline that you need if you're a plant-based eater by taking those extra supplements as well. And they vary drastically. So I have a lot of individuals that reach out to me and say, "Hey, I'm taking this multivitamin and it has choline. Am I okay?" And a lot of times I say, "No, you're not," because multivitamins usually have 15 milligrams of choline, maybe 20 milligrams of choline.
You want
So
hundreds per day.
yeah, so you need hundreds, right? So if you are deficient or are eating mainly a plant-based diet, it is recommended that you actually get a bottle that has actual choline in it in the
Mhm.
hundreds of
Mhm.
milligrams per day.
Um, yeah, and I'll just ask you this real quick because I think it's an interesting and important question. This is not the first time I've heard of this type of thing where if you're eating a primarily plant-based diet, it's harder to get enough of, in this case, choline in your diet to hit your minimum requirements. That's true of various other nutrients as well. And yet, if I go see a doctor, the last time I went to a physician here in my home in Seattle, and I hear this from all sorts of major health institutions, they promote primarily a plant-based diet. Is it strange to you at all that plant-based diets are really in vogue right now with major health organizations, and yet they're often low in bioavailable nutrition like choline?
Yeah, I think what that is, it points to aspects of, the literature suggesting that if you eat red meats, if you eat a lot of these other products, eggs, for example, that might spike, cholesterol, for example. We know cholesterol can be risk factors for heart attacks and other potential ailments that you find throughout your body and your brain, right? But I think what we're doing in our lab and really the community that is looking at a variety of these nutrients that are really needed is raising awareness, right? So if you look at the amount of individuals that actually know that they need choline, I do this every time I give a lecture. I always say, how many of you know what the recommendations for choline are? Usually you get two or three people out of a crowd of,
Mm-hmm.
50,
Yeah,
100. So 90% of Americans are currently not getting the adequate amount of choline that they need.
90.
90%, right?
Yeah, yeah,
They're getting approximately 50% or even lower than that,
yeah.
right?
And
So
it's,
most
I imagine a lot of them don't even know that choline is a thing. It's not on the nutrition labels or anything.
Exactly. And, I was having a conversation with my younger sister recently because she's followed my work since I was a grad student and especially tied to aspects of pregnancy. And she's pregnant and she asked me, "Hey, I'm pregnant and I've read all your literature, choline. How much should I take? Should I discuss this with my doctor?" And she did. And her doctor said, "Well, we just focus on folic acid. If you want to take choline, that's kind of on your end. But we know that it's recommended by the Institute of Medicine and it has been since 1998. Yet, it's not being pushed as much compared to other aspects of the nutritional realm in pregnant women. So part of what we're doing is also trying to educate physicians and other medical professionals to understand that this is critically important based on all the literature that we're publishing and putting out there.
Okay. Well, choline's important. I'm definitely getting enough choline because I eat a lot of eggs, I would imagine.
Very good.
So choline reminds me of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain. So why don't we talk about the role of choline in brain stuff now? How is it tied to brain function in basic terms?
Yes, so choline is essentially the precursor to acetylcholine. What is acetylcholine? Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. You can think about it as a chemical messenger signal. What it does, it mediates a lot of behaviors. It is released in synapses that allow neurons to communicate, and it produces a lot of important functions for us. So, for example, learning and memory relies on acetylcholine. If you don't have adequate acetylcholine, thereby not enough choline, that's gonna, that behavior is gonna be affected. It's also important in what's called the neuromuscular junction. So you can think about the projections from your spinal cord that are part of your central nervous system that are going to synapse to skeletal muscles that allow us to move our muscles, right? Acetylcholine allows that to happen, right? So if you're deficient in acetylcholine, a lot of these behaviors are going to become compromised. And what we see in Alzheimer's disease is that acetylcholine is one of the first signs. The drop in acetylcholine is typically what you see in many cases of Alzheimer's disease because the neurons that are actually producing this are compromised and begin to die. Right. And we also find that individuals that eat less choline have an increased risk to developing Alzheimer's disease. There's been a few papers that have been published in the last 2 years, one coming from my lab that actually shows that decreases in choline can actually lead to decrease in acetylcholine, which can predispose a person to develop disorders like Alzheimer's disease.
Is there any evidence that like supplementing or getting is there any evidence that nutrient supplementation or just ensuring that you're starting to get adequate levels of things like choline can like reverse problems like neurodegenerative problems?
Yeah, so there has been a trial that was done many years ago where they actually supplemented with a form of choline, phosphatidylcholine, and they didn't find benefits in a clinical trial. However, I will say that that was a study that was done in patients that were more in advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease. So can it reduce the plaques, the tau tangles? No. If they're there, they're there, and the choline is not going to remove that, right? However, what we have found based on the literature is that if you start early, if you get your recommended daily intake amount, in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, you're essentially preventing aspects of the disease that are risk factors and can initiate the cascade of pathological burden that you see in these specific disorders. So in my lab, we've published a few papers in rodent models actually showing two phenomena. One, if you don't have choline in your diet, it increases, it leads to obesity, it leads to liver pathology, it increases plaques and tangles in the brain and neuroinflammation. That's if you don't have enough choline, right? Or don't have any choline in your diet. The opposite is true. If you supplement with more choline, you actually reduce the amyloid beta and the pathology that you see in Alzheimer's disease. However, it has to start pretty early.
Yeah.
If you try to use it as an intervention where the pathology has already began,
Yeah.
it's kind of like it's too late, right? It might help with aspects of metabolic function. If someone has diabetes, we actually are working on a study right now where we're touching on aspects of that, and we can get back to that. But the evidence does show that it needs to be done throughout your life to truly have profound benefits in the prevention and also in healthy cognitive aging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the name of the game here is prevention, and that makes sense. Like from a nutritional standpoint, if you're getting adequate nutrition, your body will be able to do the things it needs to do and be less likely to develop pathologies. But at least in the case of something like Alzheimer's, when you've got tangled microtubules and proteins in your brain, you're not going to get rid of those most likely if you simply start taking something that you're already deficient in for a long time.
Exactly, 100% correct. So I'm a big advocate, and I share this with everyone when I give these talks that this is established and recommended by the Institute of Medicine since 1998 when they first established that it contributes to fatty liver disease. So everyone should be taking it, right? It's not going to hurt you. I've had questions about, hey, what happens if I take too much choline?
Right.
You need to take approximately 8 times the recommended daily intake amount to have toxic effects. The 2 toxic effects are typically low blood pressure, and you start to smell like a fish because of the metabolite that occurs. Yeah. I mean, not very bad side effects, but
no, but hey, that at least tells you that's a clear marker of like, oh, hey, I can back off the choline.
Yeah, but getting close to 4 grams of choline a day
That's a
would be
lot.
that would be very difficult to do, right?
Well,
Most supplements and tablets that are out there usually give you about 250 milligrams of choline. Yeah.
yeah. So you can literally target the recommended dosage in the 400 or 500 milligram range or so, and then you could just go above that to be safe a little bit, and you'll be fine.
Right, yeah. And we've actually done a few studies that have tested, this is in rodents, but there are studies that have been done in humans, and I'll talk a little bit about those as well. That we typically go at 4.5 times the recommended daily intake amount, right?
Hmm.
Which is, still not very close to the 8 times, right? And we find pretty drastic benefits in terms of cognition, reductions of neuroinflammation, reductions. Actually, well, one of the big things that we're finding now is that it can actually regulate weight, right? So we actually found that mice that were on a choline deficient diet gained about 30% more weight than animals that had choline.
Really? Same
Right. Yeah.
exact diet, just
Yes,
choline was deficient.
yes. This is published in 2023 in Aging Cell, and you can look it up. Choline deficiency promotes a lot of system-wide pathologies and dysregulation of metabolic function. And we found that when we looked at the mice, we were pretty shocked. The only thing we did is take choline away from their diet, and they gained
Yeah.
tremendous amount of weight. Yeah.
It is a very basic way to think about this. So why would it have effects on weight and inflammation in the brain and insulin? Like all of these things is a way to think about this simply that choline is a precursor to probably multiple key signaling molecules that have a variety of roles in metabolism and various aspects of biology. And therefore, if you're deficient in it, it's just going to sort of disrupt signaling in lots of different ways.
Yes, that's exactly the way to think about it, right? And it's probably going to do it not in a way where you think where it's like, oh, you're probably going to get, there's going to be obesity, and then you're going to get aspects of diabetes or glucose metabolism impairments, and then Alzheimer's disease or pathologies that can initiate that. They're all probably happening synergistically,
Yeah.
and ultimately you see all of these pop up at the same time. But the one thing that I just want to make this comment. The one thing that we're very excited about is that we're really starting to show that in human cases, individuals that are pre-diabetic have low circulating choline in their blood, right? So if you take individuals that have a BMI of obese, and you compare those individuals to individuals that are normal, healthy weight individuals, you find that the levels of choline in their blood in the obese individuals are drastically lower. Why is that exciting? Because if we can address aspects of pre-diabetes by simply supplementing with choline, that would be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. And so some of the results that you were pointing to that you found in rodents, to what extent are those results that you're rescuing choline deficiency in mice that are deficient versus can you take normal mice eating sort of standard mouse chow and then supplement with extra choline and then see improvements in anything?
Yeah, actually, that was the premise of a lot of this work, right? So once again, some of the first reports showing that choline supplementation was beneficial comes back from studies done, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where they actually took normal rats and they just gave them more choline versus normal choline, and they actually found that having more choline actually improved their behaviors in terms of learning and memory and other forms of cognition. That actually established that choline is critically important, and more of it could be beneficial. What we're trying to do with our work is to say, is a deficiency in it, which is more prevalent in our society, potentially leading to a lot of these detrimental outcomes that we see in disease.
And so everything points to obviously deficiency is very bad. You definitely want to avoid choline deficiency. Supplementation is good. Even liberal supplementation can have benefits in non-deficient animals, and you're going to be pretty hard pressed to overdose on something like this.
Yes, yeah. I mean, like I said, getting close to 3-4 grams of choline a day would be very difficult, especially since most of us are deficient, right?
Yeah.
Most people are deficient. I myself, my whole lab, we are big proponents of taking choline on a daily basis, given our literature. So we have to practice what we preach.
Interesting. Yeah. And we talked about Alzheimer's earlier. You talked about some of the effects choline has on metabolism, things like insulin resistance. How has the thinking started to change around Alzheimer's and whether or not it's rooted in things like insulin resistance and a metabolic issue?
Yeah. So, going to the evidence, as you mentioned, type 3 diabetes, right? The individuals that are typically an obese BMI, as well as have forms of type 2 diabetes, typically have an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And the reason why we believe there's a link is because insulin resistance can happen in the periphery, but it can also happen in your brain, right? If your receptors in your brain that require binding of insulin to allow glucose to come in are now compromised, that is going to start to affect the function of those neurons. And studies have shown that if you don't have proper glucose in your brain, that can lead to neuroinflammation. And what does that neuroinflammation tie back to? A lot of these proteinopathies that we discussed earlier in this conversation. Yeah.